Hey there, welcome to another lecture of Principles of Ecology. It's a course being taught at LSU under the heading Bio 4253. I recorded this lecture already and then didn't have any audio, so here I am recording it for a second time. So this is the joys of me being silly and not figuring out the audio correctly. So this week we'll be going over niche concepts and competition. So I'm getting my notes and everything ready on the side. I'm going to share my screen now for housekeeping. The readings this week will be this Stitch the Niche paper. This was part of a, I think, 3-part paper series, sort of going over the utility of the niche, the sort of philosophical background of the niche, and all that niche. But they do a really good job sort of defining concepts here. I really like sort of that paper. And then the second paper is it's to sort of separate in your mind maybe more clearly the sort of relationship between the species' geographic distribution and its niche. So I said niche like 10 times without defining it. So now we're going to start by sort of defining what we mean by a species niche. And that's sort of hard, right? Because the species niches has been historically an ambiguous concept. So starting with Grinnell, Joseph Grinnell, 1917 was the first usage of the word niche to describe basically the distribution, not the niche, of a bird species, the California thrasher. And he defined it in a way, right here, let's say. All right, before we define it explicitly via the sort of 3 main definitions, which are Grinnell's definition, Elton's definition, and then Hutchinson's definition. We'll first talk about what it is in a more general sense. So you may have heard the term niche to describe like, oh, that person has very niche tastes in music. So meaning like a small subset of the available superset. So like out of all music, I only listen to this bit, this little chunk. Much like that, a species niche is the subset of climatic conditions where a species can persist. That's sort of our working definition. There's a lot to unpack within that definition, and so we'll go into that in terms of like the historical like etiology of the word. But we'll focus on science, obviously. This is an ecology course. I go into here about like the utility of the niche. In my mind, the utility of the niche comes from being able to operationalize and build conceptual theory around the idea that of like species tolerance to environmental conditions. And so things like niche overlap, where you consider the niches of 2 different species and how much they sort of coincide and what that means. And so many famous experiments are sort of designed to look at niche overlap and how it relates to the structuring of ecological communities, which we'll go over fairly soon. We're going to shift from, right now we're in population, we did individual variation, we're going to do the niche, and then we're going to do communities. All right. It's also a very nice abstraction. A species niche is defined as such. It's defined at the species level. And that dates back to even like the sort of earliest definitions of Grinnell and Elton. They said it was one distributional unit for a species or subspecies, meaning the individual doesn't have a niche, the species has a niche. Many people will disagree with that, but I don't agree that they're right. I think the species or the niche is a species level concept. And I'll treat it as such in this lecture. All right. And so now we're going to go into sort of how the niche is defined through the lens of like the historical development of the term. And so it first started with Joseph Grinnell, naturalist, 1917. He defined the niche pretty much entirely based on the habitat that a species is found in. And so he would say like, look at this tree. This tree is a niche for this species. That's cool. It inherently inflates a geographic location with the niche, which I think is something that niche theory has progressively tried to like push back against since the 1950s or so. But that's fun. And then 10 years later, Joseph Grinnell, not Joseph Grinnell. Is his name Joseph Grinnell? It is Joseph Grinnell. I just misremember. No, I just said Joseph Grinnell. Joseph Grinnell was 1917. Charles Elton was the next one. He's a community ecologist, 1927. He defined the niche slightly different. He operationalized it a little bit more than Grinnell had, but he defined it to include competitors. He basically said the niche of the animal is its place in the community with respect to its prey and its predators and other organisms in the community, which is cool, but it also really it assumes that communities are in equilibrium, right? So if I say that a species niche is defined by a set of other species, how do invasive species fit in? If a species invades this community, is that species now a part of my Eltonian niche if I'm not driven to extinction? And so, yeah, that is a little bit odd as well. Because what do we really want out of a niche definition? We want it to be operationalized. So we want it to be able to like be quantitative, to be tested, to inform us of something. We want it to be sort of firm in its bounds. So a lot of these, like Elton and Grinnell, were a little bit maybe less than concrete, and definitely not sort of quantifiable. And so in I think it was 57 or 59, I always forget. I think it was 1957 at Cold Springs Harbor closing, or at the symposium. Hutchinson made his closing remarks, and he defined the niche. He attempted to do just that, to make the niche quantitative, to give it firm set of like characteristics and bounds. And what he did was he essentially said, all right. He essentially said, let's imagine a space where there's the niche is defined in terms of the abiotic variables that control a species distribution. He said the niche exists as this, he called it an n-dimensional hypervolume. Here we'll only consider 2 dimensions. So he's saying that in this 2-dimensional space, let's say we have temperature as one axis, and precipitation, which I'm just going to say precip, as the other axis, where points in this space correspond to specific values of temperature and precipitation. And this box represents the total space of all temperature and precipitation variation. Hutchinson defined a niche a species niche as an n-dimensional hypervolume. So hypervolume just meaning some dimensional complete volume in this environmental or niche space. And so here we have a 2-dimensional niche space of potential temperature and precipitation values that a species could have. And here in red, we have the actual niche of a species. To go into this a little bit further, we can consider, say, okay, so this span, right, along the x-axis. so from this corner to this corner, or this corner to this corner, whatever, is basically the temperature range that a species can persist at. And Hutchinson made sure he was clear to define this boundary, this hypervolume, as a persistence threshold or a persistence boundary. What that means is, like when we first went over single species population dynamics, we were describing things and said if little r is less than 0 or lambda is less than 1 in a single species population sense, that population will tend toward extinction. That is what this persistence boundary is. Outside of the persistence boundary here, the species will go extinct in finite time. Inside the persistence boundary, the species persists. It exists and continues doing good, doing species stuff. All right, I think I touched on all the big parts of Hutchinson's definition. He said n-dimensional hypervolume. There's a persistence threshold, which he's giving it some like mathematical rigor. We're all of a sudden like, oh, okay, now I know how to actually quantify what a niche is. I noticed that it has nothing to do with geographic space, right? So like, we can even sort of plot this out. Let's have a separate plot. Whoop. I'm going to turn this green. And now this is actually, let's think of this as actual geographic space. And so this is like latitude and longitude. I'm just going to write X and Y. And a species can exist. This is a gross oversimplification, but let's consider this a contiguous landmass. And this green box is where the species is distributed in space. Okay. Okay. Hutchinson was clear to sort of like separate the idea of a geographic distribution from the niche. Where this starts to become difficult to sort of reconcile or wrap your head around is this subset of geographic space. The environmental conditions that typically go into the niche, like temperature and precipitation, are non-randomly distributed, right? What I mean by that is that there is spatial autocorrelation in things like temperature across a landscape. I am in Louisiana now. I am in Louisiana now. It's quite warm and rains a fair bit in Louisiana. The temperature here is more similar to the temperature in a nearby place like Mississippi or Texas than it is to Illinois or Montana or somewhere else. And so a species geographic distribution sort of is related to, is directly linked to its niche. But this lower thing is not a niche, right? The distribution of a species isn't a niche. And Hutchinson was pretty clear about that. And how he was clear about that is that he defined two different niches, or sort of, yeah, he defined two different niches. So yeah, they're both n-dimensional hypervolumes. And the first, like you can imagine it as being defined as where the species is. Meaning it is the abiotic conditions corresponding to where the species is known to actually occur. Okay, how do we operationalize that? What we do is we look at a species distribution. We take observations in nature. We say the species is found in these locations. We can then measure temperature and precipitation at each one of the locations where the species is found. And then in this space, in this niche space, this is niche, top is niche, bottom is like distribution. In this niche space, we can then define the climatic space where the species occurs. He called that the realized niche because it's where the species actually occurs. It's what is realized on the landscape and in the niche space. He also defined something called the fundamental niche. The fundamental niche of a species is where the species could be. What he meant by that, and what I think he meant by that rather, is where a species is in geographic space does not have to be where the only places it could be, right? And so maybe competition limits the ability of this species to spread out this way, or maybe it's just geographically or it's dispersal limited. So there's like a mountain, right? I'm not even trying to draw a mountain. I'll mess it up so then. There's a mountain right here, and the species just it can't disperse. It can't get over the mountain, even though on the other side of that mountain is a different climatic regime that could potentially expand the niche. And so basically, Hutchinson said there's these two niches. There's the fundamental niche and the realized niche. And we can think about the times where they'd be related to one another. So I'm need to scroll down to make sure. Okay, nice. I'm right on. Yeah, we're good. Okay, and we can think about how they're related to one another. And so if I plot this out, and then I'm going to turn this like orange maybe, or maybe a different color entirely, so it's easier to see. Maybe like a nice blue. What do you think? I'm going to go blue. Okay. So this is a situation where this is, let's say this is the fundamental niche, and this is the realized niche. That is a situation where we know that the species is not dispersal limited, competition is not influencing its distribution and subsequent niche. The realized niche is the same as the fundamental niche. I think you can already tell where I'm leading you to, and it's what tends to happen, at least in sort of our course approximation, is that the fundamental niche, which is in red, is larger than the realized niche, which is in blue. And so typically you'll see something like this, where the realized niche is a subset of the sort of that fundamental niche, which is that space where the species could occur. And so how you determine could occur, like what if I had the ability to take the species, bring it into the lab, and or like manipulate conditions outside, and saw where the species was able to persist, then I would actually get at the true fundamental niche of the species. And so it's this space here, the difference between these two, that like sort of signals to one of those other ecological processes like dispersal limitation or competition, or the sort of interaction of two variables, right? So maybe like I could take this much precipitation and I could take this much temperature, but when those things are combined in the right corner of this, the effects are not additive. They're sort of non-linear related or pack a punch. There are also situations, believe it or not, that the realized niche could be larger than the fundamental niche. It's rare, not many people talk about it, but whatever, it's cool. Let's think about how that could happen. I think one of the most sort of easy ways to wrap your head around it would be like microhabitat variation. And so the species is actually seeing something that is within its niche, but out like, so the scale of measurement influences the niche delineation. What I mean by this, I'm trying to think of a good example. Let's say a small mammal, a mouse, can only exist at a certain temperature. However, if enough shade is present, it could exist by just being underneath in a shaded area. It still is that temperature. It's still outside of its fundamental niche in terms of temperature, but it's able to have like behavioral modifications or find shade or microhabitat that sort of push it. That's not even that clean of an example. I think a cleaner example would be the effect of facilitation. And so if I measure something in the lab and I say it has a temperature range between here and here with this red box, and that's its fundamental niche. And temperature is not a very good example, but let's say, so like some plants, like desert plants, they require there to be some structure in the soil. And so other plants that are able to colonize a site facilitate the dispersal of plants that otherwise couldn't exist there in that site by having the root mass there. And so that example almost starts to conflate geography with niche, but doesn't quite, because we can consider a niche axis such as like soil stability, however you quantify that. So yeah, that was a little bit of an aside, but basically the idea is that we have these two different flavors of niche, fundamental and realized, and what we see is always the realized niche, right? Whenever I go out and observe species, I'm observing their realized distribution. And if I map that into niche space, I am observing their realized niche. Yeah, I also talk a little bit in the notes about how the Hutchinsonian niche did not include biotic interactions or biotic variables as the Eltonian niche did. For good reason. I mean, competitor densities can influence persistence, but competitive exclusion, I think, tends to be rather rare in natural systems, but we will talk about it next lecture, I think. Yeah, and also there's no such thing as like there may not be such a thing as a minimum species density. So all of a sudden, like, so if I'm trying to like estimate a niche and I say the competitor density is a niche axis, there shouldn't be like a minimum, right? If in the case of zero competitors, like I'm able to persist. So all of a sudden this aspect of my niche becomes like fully to there, and there's just an upper limit in terms of competitor density that influences my persistence. And that's just a little bit hacky. It also just like sort of more, you can never measure it, right? You're assuming this weirdly like linear process of the influence of competitor density on a persistence threshold that I don't know, it's just hacky. Not ideal. It's not ideal. But there are current frameworks that do try to incorporate species interactions into the niche framework. So I don't want to like say that you can't do it or you shouldn't. I will say that you shouldn't, but I'm not saying that you can't do it because many people just do that. Because at the end of the day, the niche is a concept that we invented to try to understand and sort of quantify species in different ways, relating sort of their tolerances to the environment back to their corresponding geographic distribution, trying to figure out where species are and how many of them. That's just like essentially what population and community ecology is for. That's the mission statement. Okay. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about like sort of niche, like macroecology almost, because I think I do this to try to like really cement the relationship between these two things, right? Between the geographic distribution on the bottom and the niche on the top. And so since the environment is abiotic axes, I'm going to change this back to temperature because competitor density is not a niche axis. Temperature and precipitation. These two variables and most niche variables tend to be spatially autocorrelated, and such that a larger geographic range of a species here, the larger this range is, the larger the space in temperature, in this temperature and precipitation space will be occupied, right? Likewise, if a species has a large tolerance range, so I'm going to do this from sort of both directions. If a species has a large tolerance range in terms of temperature and precipitation, it will also, if there's no dispersal limitation and competition, etc., natural enemies like parasites limiting the distribution, the species distribution should also be large. what this means is that there should be a direct relationship between the species geographic area that it lives in, that it is found in, and the size of the species ecological niche. And I think I linked to a paper that might be my own, so apologize for that. But it's an idea that I didn't come up with, and that is already out there, and you can see it at that link if you would like to. There's also the idea of a vacant niche that I wanted to bring up. And I think I wanted to bring it up because it further sort of refines and gets you thinking about concepts of the niche. The idea of the vacant niche, I think, is best exemplified by some of the work of Lawton, and his first name. But he's a community ecologist, and it's basically designed an experiment where he went out and studied these fern species, and there's insects that exist on these ferns. And he defined the species niche based on he said the environment's the same. So there's a fern species right next to another fern species. And I guess the fern is the niche. He conflates habitat with niche a bunch in that. But so he says, yeah, this is a niche. This plant is a niche for these insects. And he says on the first fern, there's 3 species of insects, and on the second fern, there's 10 species of insects. That means that the first fern with only 3 species of insects has a bunch of vacant niches. It has the potential to be colonized by other species, and yet they're not there. Why aren't they there? The vacant niche. It's a little bit of a silly idea because it conflates habitat with ideas of the niche. So it's very like Eltonian in its argument. It also ignores a lot of things like dispersal limitation or maybe like really small scale variation. Like, what if the ferns differed in some measurable variable that would make that like that was excluding those 7 species? You'd say it was a vacant niche. It's not a vacant niche. They can't occur there because of the structuring of something else. Like maybe the ferns produce some sort of chemical which is harmful to a subset of those insect species, and so they don't persist there. The niche concept is still good. Like there's no such thing as a vacant niche in that case. Yeah. Yeah, and so I point out that is potentially not a great way of looking at things. And I also start to address 2 things within that are sort of related to the idea of vacant niches, and and one sort of provides a nice bridge to talk about competition, which is the second part of this lecture, which I'll record as a different video. And that's competitive exclusion. And so the idea of, okay, so let's say these 2 niches are now 2 different species. So before we defined them as like, oh, this is the fundamental unrealized niche of the same species. This is now 2 different species. We might imagine that in the case where species have completely separate niches, here, that they don't co-occur. There's no geographic overlap. Because if you were to take these and try to project them into geographic space, you can't find any location at a point that has a temperature and precipitation within both of these ranges. But you could now, right? So I push these together, and now there's a little bit of overlap, right? And so there are probably geographic locations that correspond. So then the other species can co-occur. And the idea is that, or one idea is that the amount of overlap in 2 species niches can be used as a proxy for the strength of competition between those 2 species. So here, there's very little overlap. Maybe these species don't compete that strongly. If there's a lot of overlap like this, the species co-occur really frequently. And the idea is that they should interact and compete quite strongly. All right. And then competitive exclusion is something slightly different because it's saying there's a limiting resource. So in the idea of of niche overlap and competition strength, it's still on competition, but competitive exclusion says that if these two species are coexisting on a limiting resource, they will not do so indefinitely. One species will always exclude another when competing for a single limiting resource in finite time. Okay. Yeah, I might move that around. It doesn't fit as well as I thought it would initially. I don't know why that sort of dabbled in there, but it's a really interesting thing. And so it was shown originally with two protist species. That was Gauss that initially tested and formulated this idea of competitive exclusion. And why this could affect the idea of vacant niches is that maybe those that fern that only had 3 species, maybe those 3 species are the ones that, for some reason, due to stochasticity or something, got to be numerically dominant and then had density-dependent competitive effects on whatever the other species that were there were, and drove them to extinction. And so competitive exclusion can be one reason why you see quote unquote vacant niches that don't exist. The second reason would be, the second potential reason out of many, is historical contingency. And so this is a really fun sort of thing where the order at which individuals or species arrive to a community influences who ends up in that community at some time t in the future. So what that means, like functionally, I'm just going to copy these and scroll down. I'm messing all this up. I sort of want both of these. All right, and I don't need precip. Okay, so let's say these are species. They're not niches anymore. They define species. And we have some axis of time where time is going out this way. So you have, that's ugly. That's so bad. And that's embarrassing. Let's just change that to a box. All right. So you have this axis of time where that your community is assembled on. And you can imagine a situation where both species arrive at the community together, right? So at this time right here, these two species arrive and boom, they're able to persist. There's coexistence. Cool, okay. Let's say there's another situation where the species, oops, I moved up here. This species arrives slightly before this species. And so this species is able to persist and this species cannot. At some time in the future, you have this one species community where this species was there, but due to the order of arrival of the species, this blue species is excluded. And then we can also imagine the same situation, but like this, where this species now arrives later than this species, and this earlier arriving species is able to stop the invasion of this. And so even though you introduce it, it doesn't take hold in the community, and now you have a one species community. Hopefully that makes sense. There's been some really cool work done, largely in my expertise, or in my reading from like Tadashi Fukami, who does really amazing work on this idea of historical contingency. You'll also see it defined in the literature or as priority effects. And yeah, I give an example of coral reef communities, but it exists sort of in many different types of communities. All right. Scroll up again. We're going to deal with this diagram now, because I want to talk about niche evolution. And so a species, okay, so let's consider this geographic space here. This species occupies this set of environments. These, due to climate change, the overall trend is sort of shifting, right, to warmer and largely drier, but some places wetter, conditions. This species has like sort of three options, right? It can disperse to try to track its favorable habitat. So it'll move in space to track what its niche sort of says that it can tolerate. It can adapt, right? So these can either be like behavioral adaptations that would not change the niche, or it could be actual like niche evolution, right? So yeah, or it could die. That's the third one's die. And now let's revisit the niche evolution one. Okay, so the idea here would be, let's say we have the species niche, the red box, and some populations of this species exist at this niche limit, at this upper limit of temperature, so that I'm going up and down on, through processes like evolution or other, I don't know, maybe other processes. For some reason, evolution is one that pops in my head. The species can actually potentially extend this out. This niche limit doesn't have to be a concrete limit if the species has some mutation which provides more temperature tolerance. So that would be niche evolution. It also could be the case where the species shifts the niche, like sort of like that, where it loses some of its temperature tolerance at the low end and it raises or increases it at the high end. I feel like that's more rare though, because really like these populations of these species tend to occur like within a smaller portion of this niche space, if that makes sense. So at the southern end of the species geographic distribution, it's going to occupy, that's going to be a specific subset of the actual niche of the species. And so it's not like every population is experience or has sort of the same upper and lower bounds that it is experiencing. Putatively, it has the same upper and lower bounds. It's just not experiencing the full range of climatic variation that it could. Okay, hopefully that made sense. It wasn't confusing. If it was confusing, we'll go over it in more detail during the lecture. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of niche partitioning, which isn't really like, it's like vaguely related to niche concepts, but it's worth talking about. And so, okay, so we went over competitive exclusion and this idea that niche overlap should be related to competition strength, meaning like the more the two species utilize the same niche, the stronger they should compete, and the more likely it is that one will exclude the other. How coexistence can be achieved, so having persistent communities of two species, are through niche partitioning, either in terms of spatial niche partitioning or temporal niche partitioning. And so we're going to use the same plot that we use for historical contingency. So let's say if two species are active at the same time of day. So now this is like time of day. So these two species are only active during this portion of the day. That means that they're likely to directly interact and to maybe directly compete. That might not be sustainable for these two species. However, if they just divide certain times of the day, so this species, even though it competes for like some of the same limiting resource as this species, but is active during a different part of the day, these two species may be able to coexist. And so that's temporal niche partitioning. I give an example of desert plants that are more successful during wet years and some that are more successful during dry years. So this has to do with sort of like variability along these niche axes and how it relates to the ability of plants to coexist. I don't think I have to say it in the notes, but this is basically called the storage effect, or related to concepts of Chessonian. So there's the guy who set up all the coexistence theory that we follow largely, is named Peter Chesson. And he came up with this thing called the storage effect, where even though two species are competing, and even though the conditions at some time here, if this was sometime here may be really, really stressful, such that a species would actually go extinct, because through time, because there were really good conditions here, the storage effect says that that species can persist just with a negative growth rate, basically, sheerly as an effect of having really good conditions and having a really high growth rate previously. So it's a way to sort of think about how variability in climate as a function of time can muddy this a little bit. So this species may actually be able to persist here, where my mouse is, but only for a little bit. It wouldn't be true persistence, right? It would just be this transient, like, ooh, until conditions improve back within the range of its tolerance, of its actual niche. So hopefully that doesn't confuse you. If so, I apologize, and we'll go over it more in the lecture. Okay. And so that was temporal niche partitioning related to the storage effect, which I can go over more, or we can just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. But there's also spatial niche partitioning. And so that's when, so down here we have this axis of time. If we just change that to space. So things like, if you had a community of anoles, which are small lizard species, you can have a community of like 7 or what's the example, like 15, as many as 15 different anoles living pretty much in the same area and utilizing the same tree. But what they're doing is they're really stratifying where they occur on that tree. So there's some that specialize in the leaf litter, and there's the next species will exist in the branches or in the middle of the tree. And by doing that, by partitioning out that space, they're able to coexist and lead to actually really high species diversity, even when they may be competing for the same resource. And then I give another example of Darwin's finches, which they weren't competing for the same resource, right? So that's an example where there's a plethora of different seed sizes. And in order what led to coexistence was their specialization on a certain subset of seed sizes. And that led to the evolution of beak shape and morphology that was reflective of those specializations, that allowed the bird to really capitalize on one specific type of seed. And so that's sort of like radiation and beak variation created different species of finches that capitalized on different seeds and were able to coexist. So that's not really a good example of spatial niche partitioning. I don't know why I put it there. But it is a cool example of adaptive radiation and coexistence. So let's move on from there. All right. I think that's actually all I wanted to talk to. This competition stuff will be in the next lecture. And hopefully now the audio actually recorded and I'm not just repeating a bunch. But yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen now. Sweet. And thank you very much. And I will see you next time.